University of Texas. Today, our session is called Preserving the Stories While Transforming the Building and Overcoming Challenges in Adaptive Reuse. So how this panel is going to go is we have a couple of speakers who I'm very excited to share with you today. I will introduce each one before they talk, and they'll give a short presentation. And at the end, we'll come back for questions and sort of a group discussion. So our first presenter today is Amber Anderson, and she manages the state and federal historic rehabilitation tax credit programs for the Utah SHPO. In this role, she primarily assists historic property owners in crafting rehabilitation plans that meet preservation guidance in order to secure financial incentives. Prior to this, she worked for a cultural resource management firm as an architectural historian, where she conducted large architectural surveys of buildings all throughout the Northeast. She also holds a Master in Science in Historic Preservation from Clemson University. So Amber, you can take it away.
Okay, let me try to share my screen. And okay, am I full screen and good? Okay, see some thumbs ups. Okay, hi everyone. As Kathleen mentioned, my name is Amber Anderson and I manage the historic rehabilitation tax credit programs for the state of Utah. So there's a federal and a state program. I'm going to talk a little bit about a successful tax credit project and how tax credit projects help maintain the story of a building. I'll talk a little bit about basic program requirements, and then we'll look at a case study. So first of all, what are tax credits? A few of us, I think, are going to talk about them today. So there are federal and state programs. The federal program is obviously available nationwide, and then many states throughout the country also have state programs. Our program in Utah is for residential buildings, but the federal program is for income-producing buildings only. And the federal program also requires that a rehabilitation project be spending a minimum amount. It's different for every building, so I'm not gonna look into that, but there's a calculation based on essentially it's usually a large sum of money. So it's what we call substantial rehabilitations in order to qualify for the federal program. The federal and state programs both require that a building is listed on the National Register of Historic Places, and that can be either individually or as part of a larger historic district. And then both programs also require that the entire project meet what are called the Secretary of the Interior standards for rehabilitation. And this is not just the exterior of the building, but also the interior, any work on the site, landscaping, and things like that. So we'll talk a little bit about that today and how following the standards helps to preserve a building's history. So, sorry. So there are the Secretary of the Interior standards. The Secretary of the Interior puts out standards for rehabilitation as well as preservation, restoration, and then also reconstruction. And we only care about the rehabilitation standards for the tax credit programs. And that's because we understand that in order to reuse a building for a modern use, you have to make some changes. However, the changes need to be done in a way that continues to allow the building to tell its unique story. So the first two quotes here are directly from the Park Service website and essentially explain that the standards are meant to allow a building to be used long-term, but with new uses, while preserving the tangible physical aspects of the building, but also acknowledging the need to create modern uses. There's 10 standards. They're intentionally vague. That's because we want them to be applicable to all building types and materials. So we need to be able to apply the 10 standards to 18th century warehouses as well as 1960s houses. So they're vague in that way. So the building I'm going to talk to you about is located in Salt Lake City's warehouse district. And warehouses aren't necessarily untold stories, which I know is the theme of the conference today, but they're typically not, it's not really something you think of as historic. I guess a lot of people don't when you talk about warehouses. And so the Salt Lake City Warehouse District has a period of significance of 1869 through 1966. And in National Register speak, the period of significance is essentially the period of time in history when the important things happened. And this can change over time, but the current period of significance for this district is those dates listed here. And 1869 might ring a bell for some people, especially out west, but that's the year that the Transcontinental Railroad was completed in Utah, in northern Utah. And shortly after that was completed, spur lines reached down to Salt Lake, which allowed Salt Lake to really grow as the rail yards started growing. And this all really occurred on Salt Lake City's west side. And so as the rail lines met there, a lot of industry popped up, and a large ethnic population also grew because immigrants were coming from all over the country and the world. And they also very much worked in these more industrial parts of town, in the warehouses and the factories that popped up there. And so the National Register nomination breaks up the different periods of history into more digestible chunks. And so the building we're going to look at is actually from the post-war era, which starts in about 1946. And this really marks the transition of rail transport to more automobile focuses. And so the building we're going to look at is 723 West Pacific Avenue in Salt Lake City. And it was actually built in 1951 for the United States Postal Service. And it really signaled that transition to automobile transportation because the building was specifically made to house the fleet vehicles for the post office. And that's really where they did all the maintenance for the Salt Lake City area. And so here's the before and after of the front of this building. That they didn't change the brick. The photos are just, the coloring's a little weird, so I apologize for that. But so you can kind of see that there was a focus on automobiles for this building. This elevation doesn't show it as much as some of the others, but at least on the front, you can see there's two large doors for vehicles rather than just man doors. And so in order to follow the Secretary of the Interior standards for this project, they couldn't exactly keep these large solid garage doors, as you can see in the before photograph, but they needed them to be more usable for the now office space that's in the building. And so in order to follow the standards, they turn these doors into large windows, one with the front door put inside of it, but then they also, you can't really tell in the photos, but the glazing pattern essentially mimics the historic garage door that would have been there. So this is a good way of retaining the character of this front facade while also making it usable for the modern office space. And windows are a really big one in any kind of a tax credit project or just historic preservation projects in general. And windows are really important because they tell a lot about this history of a building. They tell a lot about the function of a building. Sometimes they tell stories about the craftsmanship and the people who made the windows. In factory buildings, they're really important because they tell a lot about the function. These metal casement windows, you'll see a lot in factory buildings, sometimes up high because they needed to let the light in without letting a lot of heat in. You can see the operable section in this window. It's in the middle where the metal is a little bit thicker. It would have opened as a casement window. And so this allowed heat and fumes and things like that to escape out as they rose. And so that just really tells an important story about what the building was used for. And so maintaining the historic window is usually our first priority, and that would be the best way to follow the Secretary of the Interior standards. And in this case, they were able to do that. So they did replace the glass, and then they hand repaired and restored all of the metal. Sometimes replacements are appropriate. Sometimes the original material is gone or too far gone. And so in that case, it would have been really important to get a replacement window that matched these proportions really well so that you could still tell the story of how that window operated, how there was an operable section, and how the light was allowed in the building. So standard number 1 also talks about finding an appropriate use for a historic building. It's great if you can reuse the building for its original purpose, but that's often not the case. So finding a use that is compatible with the historic character of the building so that you don't have to make a lot of changes is really the best way to follow standard number 1. And as you can see here, this transition from a large warehouse garage kind of space to an open office space was a really good way to do that. They didn't have to finish out the ceiling. They didn't have to break up the space like they might have had to with apartments. They were allowed to keep these large vehicle doors kind of with the same character as they originally had. Like I mentioned, you can see a little bit better the glazing pattern kind of has those same divisions that a garage door would have. And this is kind of in contrast to, say, if you had a historic office building or an apartment building. Those would have historically been finished out. They would have had plaster on the walls, hardwood on the floors, decorative wood molding along, the ceilings and the door frames, things like that. And so if you were to take one of those buildings and give it this industrial vibe like we see here, that really wouldn't tell the story of the building. It wouldn't maintain the historic character of a very finished space. Whereas in this case, leaving everything exposed, leaving the large open volume of space really does show you what the building did historically. So this is a great example of following the standards. And here's another photo of the inside. They understandably had to create some walls to make private office spaces, but they did it in a way that really didn't detract from the large open warehouse volume of space. So the walls didn't go entirely to the ceiling. They used a lot of glass, they used a lot of wood and metal. That way it doesn't necessarily look like it was that way originally, which is good, but you can still get the experience of that industrial warehouse. And just real quickly, this is my last slide, but I just wanted to show that preserving the historic character, allowing the building to continue to tell its story for the future, can be very economically viable. I assume there's probably going to be a little bit more discussion about this later on, but this project in particular had an overall project cost of almost 3.5 million. And I think I forgot to mention at the beginning, but the federal program provides a tax credit equivalent to 20% of most of a project's costs. So there's a few exceptions, and that's why here the second bullet mentions the qualified rehabilitation expenses. Most of that 3.5 million was a qualified expense. So a little over 3.1 million is what the tax credit was calculated on, meaning that about $630,000 is what the federal income tax credit ended up being for this project. So because the owners decided to rehabilitate the building in a way that maintained its historic character, they end up with about $630,000 back in their pocket. So it's a really great program, a really great way to incentivize doing historic preservation and maintaining the historic character of properties for many years to come. Here's my contact info. If anybody feels free to reach out if you have any questions about tax credits in Utah or anything like that. And I think we'll probably have questions at the end. So thank you.
Great, thank you so much, Amber. Okay, so next up we'll have Ruth Todd, if you want to put up your PowerPoint, if you are showing images. So Ruth Todd is an architect and planner, and she's also the president of Page & Turnbull. Page & Turnbull was one of the first architecture firms in California to dedicate its practice to historic preservation and is among the longest practicing firms in the country. Page & Turnbull approaches projects with imagination and flexibility and is committed to the conservation of significant resources, where these resources can be made to function for present and future needs. So I'm excited to see her presentation.
Thank you so much. I am trying to, here's slideshow, sorry. Can everyone see my screen? View slideshow from beginning, okay. People see this? Yes, great. Okay, thank you. I'm happy to be here today and very excited to share a project that we completed a few years ago which is the adaptive reuse of a church, a very large church that had been abandoned for a very long time, that has been adaptively reused currently for an arts and events center. In San Francisco, south of Market neighborhood. Whoops. Okay, whoops, sorry. Trying to go back. How do I go back here? Just a little bit about the building's history. The building was built primarily for the Irish Catholic community in 1861, a very early time frame for San Francisco. That was a fairly young city at that point. And the original church burned in the earthquake and fire of 1906, a very famous event in California. Maybe not the rest of the country knows about that, but it definitely influenced the physical form of San Francisco. And very quickly thereafter, a new church was constructed on the same site. And it was designed in the Romanesque Revival style, and it was built in response to the earthquake and fire, so that it was not fully unreinforced masonry. It was a steel structure, which was very helpful in the adaptive reuse project. And then in 1979, it became home of the largest Filipino parish in the United States, addressing the changing demographics of that portion of San Francisco that had evolved from primarily an Irish community to a Filipino community. And it's also somewhere that Filipino community got displaced over time when the convention center in San Francisco was constructed. And because of that displacement, there was no longer a very active nearby community to populate the church. And the church eventually closed because of some damage after the Loma Prieta earthquake in 1989. And because of the changing demographics and the lack of the Catholic community nearby, the church sat vacant for a very long time and became victim to a good bit of vandalism. And then in 2011, Page and Turnbull was approached by a group of energetic owners who wanted to do something special with this church. And it took a while to figure out what was the right, what was the appropriate use that could respect the historic character of this church, which is a San Francisco landmark, is on the National Register of Historic Places. And between 2011 and 2019, an ownership team that changed a little bit eventually figured out how to adaptively reuse this project. And it did, as Amber mentioned, it required financial incentives such as tax credits, and this also used new market tax credits to make the project financially feasible to work. What we did in our rehabilitation was to take this church and transform it in a way that respected the historic character of the exterior and the interior. We modernized the building with new systems. We made it structurally sound and safe to resist future earthquakes. We provided accessibility in conformance with the Americans with Disabilities Act. And then we created new occupiable space by inserting a mezzanine into the high volume of the church. And as I mentioned, we did utilize historic rehab tax credits and new market tax credits. And we were able to, because of the requirements of the historic preservation tax credits, we adhered very closely to the Secretary of the Interior standards for rehabilitation, and it has helped to transform the neighborhood. Some of the scope items I just wanted to briefly go over. On the exterior, we regilded the domes and the crosses in the towers of the church, and we changed the color scheme from something that was a little bit yellowish beige back to a cooler gray that reflected the original color scheme. And then the building looks like stone, but it's actually stucco scored to look like stone. And a lot of the details, which try to simulate stone, were actually either wood or sheet metal. And so there was a good bit of repair for, especially on the sheet metal end of the detailing, that required some careful craftsmanship. The other thing that had happened is when the church was deconsecrated after the Loma Prieta earthquake in 1989, and the congregation had sold a good many of the stained glass windows, that actually was beneficial for the project team because there was the desire to introduce a lot more daylight to make the interior of the space brighter for a new use. And so while the majority of the stained glass windows had been sold over time, they did, the towers still contained their stained glass, and we were able to carefully restore that stained glass while we reused and sort of mixed and matched a series of original textured glass to restore the windows, the clerestory windows. And then I don't know how much this audience understands about the issues of seismic strengthening in earthquake country in California. But what was really interesting about this particular project is all of the seismic strengthening was done in a very invisible manner, except for the rear of the church, where because of the size of the volume of the wall, shear capacity could not be met without introducing steel strongbacks on the backside of the wall. And typically people are very upset about something that's this visually obvious. But what we were able to do through historic research was find historic photographs from the 1940s that had shown that at one time at St. Joseph's Church, there had been ivy planted on that rear wall. So we were able to screen the structure with plant materials that reflected the historic character and nature of that back wall, while we were still being able to accomplish the seismic strengthening in a way that, and so this was really the only visible portion of what was a significant structural intervention. And then we were able to insert ADA ramps in entrances that came straight into the primary space without having, we didn't have room and we weren't able to provide ramps at the front entry, but we were able to provide sensitively installed ramps for accessibility on the side doors. And these are just a few sort of before and during construction images that can explain to you how deteriorated and abandoned the building was before we were able to adaptively reuse it. The slide on the right is explains how we inserted a mezzanine into this high volume space. The mezzanine has its own foundation and does not touch any of the walls. So it's completely reversible in the future, which was the primary concern of getting the tax credit approvals was the mezzanine. And we were able to do that in a way that maintained or that allowed for reversibility in the future. This is a little bit more explanation about how we dealt with the windows. This shows the insertion of the mezzanine, and we did have to cross the high volume space with a bridge in order to provide exiting for that mezzanine and code safety. Again, this is a pretty decrepit picture of before, during, and during construction. And this is an after that explains how we dealt with the mezzanine, and we had to deal with some code issues relative to entering the sanctuary space and the choir loft. And then these were along the towers, there was some intricate stained glass that was original, and these pieces were removed, taken down to Santa Cruz to an art studio, restored, and then reinstalled. And then the current use is for artists, gallery space, and event space for the tenant, who is also one of the 3 owners of the building. And I can't emphasize enough that having the ownership and the program being conducive to the historic characteristics of the architecture is very important in terms of getting a good outcome, getting enough attention from the client to make the right kinds of decisions, and making the budgets work. And that is the end of mine.
Great, thank you so much for sharing that, Ruth. So up next, we have Dr. Charlotte Lake, who's currently employed at Maryland State Historic Preservation Office and has a background in heritage conservation and construction management. They oversee the Capital Grant and Loan Unit, which administers 3 State of Maryland financial incentive programs, the African American Heritage Preservation Program, and the Historic Preservation Capital Grant and Loan programs. So Charlotte, if you'd like to take it away.
Thanks, Kathleen. All right. Try that again. It doesn't want to let me share my PowerPoint slides, so I'm just going to restart PowerPoint quick here. There we go.
Well, it wouldn't be a Zoom conference if one of the PowerPoints didn't freeze. So
that's right. Good afternoon, everyone. As Kathleen mentioned, I am with the Maryland SHPO, which is also known as the Maryland Historical Trust, or MHT, where I'm involved with construction-related projects at heritage sites. And so today I'd like to share a little bit about a few projects I've had some involvement with, primarily through the African American Heritage Preservation Program. This is a capital grant program that's administered as a partnership between MHT and the Maryland Commission on African American History and Culture. And so I'm going to touch on some of the challenges and achievements of organizations that are out there telling undertold stories. And at the end, I plan to share some links in the chat to some of these organizations and their work. The first 2 projects that I'd like to discuss involve organizations that are using their sites to serve a dual purpose, both telling untold local stories, but also to meet community needs. And the image that you see on this slide is the Kennard African American Cultural Heritage Center located in Centerville, Maryland. This building was first built in 1936 and was the area's first African American high school. It was vacant from the late 1970s until the Kennard Alumni Association started a major rehabilitation project beginning in 2010. And I have a couple of before and after photos. Hopefully you enjoy those as much as I do. This is the ground floor of the area that was the gymnasium before work started. And this is after many years of hard work on the part of the organization. This is one of the classrooms. And the Alumni Association held the grand opening in the spring of 2019. What you see here is one of those restored classrooms that is now rented out as event space for income generation. At the grand opening, there were a lot of former students who were able to attend, and they brought their children and grandchildren with them. And one of the things that was really inspiring was to see how excited the children were to get in there and see exhibits that featured their own family members, and they could connect both because they're family members, but also they were roughly their age when they were going to this school. And so I think that brought a lot of meaning to them. The center, in addition to being used for exhibit space and event rentals, also generates income by renting out office space to a couple of local commercial organizations. I'd like to turn now to the Liberty Grace Church of God in Baltimore, where the congregation is currently undertaking a wellness initiative to promote healthy eating and exercise in their community. It just so happens that they have a 1920s era duckpin bowling alley in their basement. And so their vision was to restore this bowling alley as part of their wellness initiative. This project is currently underway. And one of the challenges that we faced is finding a specialist who can actually repair the lanes and hopefully install a pin changer and ball return that won't have too much impact on the lanes themselves. The church's pastor, Reverend Dr. Terrace King, also uncovered a hidden story about this bowling alley while he was doing research about the church and the neighborhood. So the church is located in the Ashburton neighborhood of Baltimore, and this neighborhood was Baltimore's first integrated neighborhood. As demographics shifted over time, the bowling alley, which had been a local social hub for the neighborhood's Jewish community, was closed. The congregation plans to reopen the bowling alley for community use, and they're also going to paint the walls with a mural and install exhibits that tell the story of this early integrated neighborhood and also about the cooperation between local Black and Jewish residents during the civil rights movement. One of the challenges that I frequently see is access to resources for a lot of these projects. And this access is often hindered by a narrow application of preservation definitions and approaches. So I wanted to share a few examples of organizations that have pushed these boundaries, sometimes literally, in order to get their projects underway. The slide that you see here is the Jane Gates Heritage House in Cumberland, Maryland. And if that name rings a bell, it may be because you've watched Finding Your Roots by Dr. Henry Louis Gates Jr. This is the home of his great-great-grandmother, Jane Gates, who he sometimes mentions in his episodes. And she lived in this home and owned it shortly after emancipation. Another great-great-grandchild of hers, John Gates, and his wife, Sue, recently purchased the home. And they're currently rehabbing the house to be used as community space and as a research archive. Maryland has a statewide heritage area program. And so there's heritage areas throughout the state, and this comes with some funding eligibility. But unfortunately, the house was just outside the boundary of Allegheny County's heritage area, and it was also outside the local historic district. So in order to get access to more of the financial incentives at the state and local level, John and Sue got the heritage area boundary expanded, and the house is now within the boundary. And they're currently working on National Register nomination and local designations as well. This is the Havre de Grace Colored School Museum and Cultural Center, and it's another historic African-American high school. It was the first in Harford County, and until recently, it had been privately owned by a doctor's office. And when it went on the market, a group of locals who had graduated and some of their descendants came together hoping to purchase the building. Unfortunately, at first, they were unsuccessful because of the high purchase price. I believe it was something like $800,000, and for a small, newly formed local organization, that was a lot to try to fundraise in a short period of time. So they partnered with a local organization called the Community Projects of Havre de Grace. And this is an organization that basically provides sort of startup services for new small community groups, and they helped the foundation to pursue several grants and also to achieve their nonprofit status. So with all this in hand, the foundation was actually able to purchase the property, and they came up with a really creative way to do so. They paid off the mortgage of the owner at the time, and the seller then agreed to essentially donate the remainder of the appraised value in order for a tax write-off. So the school's now in the hands of graduates and descendants who are rehabbing it to use as a community and educational center. And my last example starts in October of 2018 with a police chase that ended with a police car crashing into a house in the Jonathan Street neighborhood in Hagerstown, Maryland. The Jonathan Street neighborhood is the oldest African-American neighborhood in Hagerstown. And although it's within the boundaries of the Hagerstown National Register Historic District, it's one of the few areas of that national district that's not also a local historic district. This has meant it hasn't had as much protection, and it hasn't had as much access to resources as other areas of that national district. In early 2019, local resident Reggie Turner learned that the house that you saw in the previous photo, as well as another in the neighborhood, were both scheduled to be demolished by the city. Reggie is a member of the Maryland Commission on African American History and Culture, but he's not a preservationist by trade. He's a financial advisor. So he said, I need a little more expertise in how to stop them from tearing these buildings down. And he reached out to his colleagues on the commission at MHT, at the local historical society, and at Preservation Maryland, which is the statewide preservation advocacy nonprofit in Maryland. Reggie and other local residents then formed the Western Maryland Community Development Corporation, and they are now deep in preservation and revitalization work in the neighborhood. The partnership between the Western Maryland Community Development Corporation and Preservation Maryland has been particularly fruitful. After a 45-year break, Preservation Maryland restarted their revolving fund program, and they purchased the house that you saw in that first image. And lo and behold, underneath the modern siding was hiding a log cabin. It turns out this is the oldest house in the neighborhood. And so it's now being rehabbed so that it can be sold as an affordable owner-occupied home. And they've also been conducting archaeological investigations on site to learn more about all of the previous residents back to its first occupation. These two organizations have also received a grant for $500,000 for neighborhood revitalization. And the city has taken a new interest in the neighborhood and was recently awarded a $325,000 grant for work in the neighborhood. So there's a lot going on, and it started with this house that was going to be torn down, and now there is a lot of revitalization going on. On my end, I'm really hopeful that as the pandemic comes to an end, we'll be able to do some more in-person outreach in the neighborhood. As we heard about state tax credit programs, we have one in Maryland, and residential properties are eligible. So hopefully some of the residents in this neighborhood will be able to take advantage of that program and figure out the ropes and make that work for them. I'd like to wrap up by emphasizing just how important it is for us as history and preservation professionals to really listen to and support local community organizations, perhaps especially those that are newly formed, because they're really leading the way with creative strategies, and they have such unique stories to tell. Sometimes it's just as simple as putting them in touch with the right organization, the right financial incentive, or helping figure out how to navigate regulations that are in place so that they can get what they need. But even tools that might have been created with different types of properties in mind, there's a lot we can do as professionals, either to shift how those programs work or to help community organizations figure out how they can access them. And I'd like to thank everyone for joining us today. I'm going to post, as I said, a few links in the chat, and I look forward to our conversation at the end.
Great. Thank you so much, Charlotte. I love seeing all the different case studies and can't wait to talk to you more about them. So next up, we have Dr. Stephanie Gray, who is an assistant professor of public history. And I'm just realized I don't remember how to pronounce your university's name because I always have just been emailing with you.
Don't worry, Kathleen, I'll introduce it.
Perfect. In Pittsburgh, where she specializes in public history, historic preservation, and 20th century U.S. cultural history. She earned her PhD from the University of South Carolina and has experience working with the National Park Service and the South Carolina SHPO. So if you want to begin your presentation.
Sure. Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks, Kathleen, for organizing this session. As Kathleen said, my name is Stephanie Gray, and I teach in the Public History Graduate Program at Duquesne University in Pittsburgh. And thank you all for joining us this afternoon. I am a historian of the U.S. by training, and my work locates historic preservation as a cultural process. So my teaching and my research really center around questions of how buildings and spaces communicate stories about the past, and often how buildings are reworked or transformed at various points in their lives with certain goals, ambitions, motivations to either obscure or promote certain narratives in mind from the preservationist angle. So it's from this perspective as a historian of the built environment and cultural history that I approach the preservation technique of adaptive use. And I think I may be the outlier here in this group, being housed in a university and coming at this issue from more of a philosophical standpoint, perhaps, rather than a practical or on the ground procedural one. So that being said, I really enjoy hearing from my fellow panelists about the challenges and successes they're dealing with in their positions. So today I am going to introduce one project that for me really illustrates the concern over preserving historic spaces, rehabbing historic spaces, but maybe not engaging with the histories those spaces embodied in the past. When I lived in Columbia, South Carolina, which is a place that you'll hear about later from fellow panelist Jane Campbell, I was part of a fairly large team of scholars who, over a number of years, researched the historic mental hospital campus in the city's center. Since the 1980s, 90s, the campus has been mostly vacant, and it was very clear that the large tract of land called Bull Street, because it sits on this main artery in downtown Columbia called Bull Street, it was prime real estate for development. So in a series of classes and projects led by Dr. Lydia Brandt of the University of South Carolina, the historic landscape and buildings were preserved through documentation in a digital format. So you can see here a few images I've pulled from this digital humanities project, digitizing Bull Street. So you can get a sense of the repertoire of buildings that were across the landscape of this large campus, and an image of the condition in the early 20th century of the site. Digital documentation was one way to capture the history of what happened at the former asylum at a time when it was unsure if any of the buildings on the campus would be protected. Now, over the past 10, 15 years, the 181-acre Bull Street district, as it's now been named, has become the largest city center development east of the Mississippi, and there has been real noteworthy effort to preserve pieces of the landscape. And I've highlighted a number of historic buildings that have either been already or plan to be rehabilitated for use in this new residential / commercial / entertainment district. So the goal here clearly from the developer standpoint is to breathe new life into a historically significant campus. It does disrupt the former spatial order of the mental hospital, but it allows for growth and transformation, which is of course necessary in the revitalization of any urban area. Now, from my perspective, the struggle here is how to illuminate the history of the patients, the physicians, and the staff in these spaces where they lived and worked for over 100 years that also appeals to modern functions, tastes, and sensibilities. So very briefly, I will mention two buildings on this campus. The first is the Enzer building, which was one of the first to be adaptively used. You'll see here a visual on the left of the 1939 solid brick structure before development. So kind of in an open area, you see green space to either side of it. And then on the right, you'll see it in its new setting at the end of a row of newly constructed multi-use spaces, and right in front of Columbia's minor league baseball stadium. So its setting has certainly changed over the years. Now, Enzer was built as the hospital's research center, and it housed laboratories, the parasitology department at the hospital, and the campus's morgue. When the building reopened in 2018, its first occupant was a restaurant called Bone In Barbecue. You'll see that name on one of the newly created open spaces to allow for outdoor-indoor eating. I'll flip back for just a moment so you can see that first floor windows have been transformed into this open space looking toward the stadium. Now, at first, I think a number of us kind of chuckled at the name, but then the incongruity of the former morgue on this historic campus becoming a restaurant with a tongue-in-cheek name rubbed some of us the wrong way. It seemed too much like a directed rejection of what transpired within that building in a former life. And the other building that I'll mention is the Babcock building, which was constructed at the mid 19th century, and it housed the majority of patients at Bull Street. It was the centerpiece of the state hospital, the centerpiece of the campus when you drove in, and it has been recognized for its historic and architectural significance. As you see here, one of its commendations was being placed in the National Register of Historic Places in 1981. And from the beginning of the redevelopment plan, this building was going to be rehabbed for use as apartments. So this was always part of the developer's plan. Now, very sadly for the Columbia community, the building suffered extensive fire damage last September. But the plan for rehabilitation is going to move forward, and the cupola, which is the architectural hallmark of this sprawling Kirkbride building, is going to be reconstructed. And in this case, though, we see a transformation of institutionalized housing for mentally ill patients into desirable urban living apartments, probably geared toward young professionals in Colombia. And now I don't mean to criticize the process of adaptive use here. And there does seem to be good faith efforts to honor and recognize the historical narratives associated with the site, as you can clearly see by the social media put out by the development team. And in the bottom right, you see an elderly couple who had worked in that building, that was the bakery on the historic campus, standing in front, being welcomed back to the site, standing in front of it and telling about their memories of working at the Bull Street campus. As a case study, however, I'm left questioning whether the creative process of adaptive use should include some consideration or a measure of sensitivity with regard to the historic use of the structures on this site, particularly when spaces like these embody undertold stories. The fact that this was a marginalized community in Colombia, the fact that children growing up in the first half of the 20th century would be told by their parents that they'd be sent to Bull Street if they were bad, should, I think, be acknowledged in the preservation processes happening at the site currently. And I'll wrap up here, but announced earlier this month, the University of South Carolina will build its new $300 million School of Medicine on a 16-acre plot of land within the Bull Street district. And plans at this stage include constructing a new medical school and a separate research and laboratory building. And with that in mind, I hope that opens up exciting possibilities for how a medical school can use its position on a historic medical campus to shed light on how the relationships between medical practitioners, patients, research, and treatment have changed over time. And moving forward, I hope the school can engage with the historic fabric of the state's mental hospital, overtly paying attention in preservation and adaptive use projects to ensuring the voices of the past medical communities are not drowned out by the current and future medical communities. All right, so thank you, and I'll stop sharing here.
Great, wonderful. Thank you so much, Stephanie. So next we have David Amott, who received his undergrad, master's, and PhD in architectural history and theory, and has taught architectural history at the University of Delaware, University of Utah, and Brigham Young University. Currently, he serves as the Executive Director of Preservation Utah, Utah's statewide historic preservation nonprofit organization. So David, if you'd like to begin your presentation.
Sorry, guys, it took me a while to find my mute button, even though I've been doing Zoom now for far too long. Thank you for inviting us here in Utah to the presentation. I understand that originally this conference was to be held in Utah, and I'm very sorry we here at Preservation Utah, the Utah SHPO, other parties, cannot welcome all of you here to our state and expose you personally to some of the heritage that exists here. But we welcome you anytime and hope that you'll make your way to Utah, to Salt Lake City. And when anyone on the call comes here, don't hesitate to reach out to me. We'll give you all the great local tips. My presentation dealing with the Utah State Penitentiary Adaptive Reuse Project really gets to the core of where Preservation Utah wishes to go moving forward into the future. Just a little background about our organization. We were established back in 1966 by some very establishment types here in Utah. Namely, we were established by then the governor of Utah and the First Lady of Utah. And for the longest time, the organization really focused on two stories, the pioneer era heritage of the state, as well as the Gilded Age heritage of the state. And by engaging with this and various other projects, we are self-consciously stepping out of telling just those stories exclusively into telling stories that have never been told before, stories about underrepresented communities, and in particular with penitentiary, stories that deal with sites of consciousness, if I can put it that way. By that, I mean sites that connect past struggles with today's movements for civil rights. And I really like how this presentation, this project, dovetails with a lot of other commentary that has been offered in this session. Just to give you a brief outline of this brief presentation, I want to talk a little bit about the historic context of the prison that we are trying to save and argue for its adaptive reuse, why we are doing this, and what this prison can become. And so that's the order of ideas that I'll present over the next 5 to 10 minutes. Just to let you know, first, starting off, what this resource is. Here's a great photo of the prison back in 1950, and it still looks very much like this today. The prison dates from a 10-year period of construction between 1940 and approximately 1950. This whole area where the prison now sits, a 700-acre plot, is being redeveloped shortly, because this prison is being replaced with a new prison that is being built on the other side of the Salt Lake Valley. And this area will become a tech corridor. At least that's the designation for it today. Moving forward, the state government and various developers want to develop a tech-focused, basically brand new city on the 700-acre plot. And we're arguing that this prison should stay as a part of that larger complex and contribute some historic context to this ground, which so long has served as the state penitentiary. Just some background. We did have, of course, a state penitentiary that was built before the current one that we are trying to save. And I really love this building. This building makes me all sorts of excited. I wish it was still around. This was built in an area of Salt Lake City proper called Sugar House. And we were very proud of this building when it was brand new in the Victorian era. We even put it on postcards and sent these postcards around the nation and even the world. To me, this building looks like a Victorian mansion, perhaps something on Bellevue Avenue in Newport, Rhode Island. So we were very proud of this building in the late 19th, early 20th century when it was new. By the mid 20th century, the building's fate had changed. It was a Victorian pile. It didn't have enough chrome or linoleum or formica or any of those other materials that everyone loved in the mid-century to, I guess, appeal to people. And it was just considered hideous and ugly. And worst of all, it was considered to be a disgrace. Here's an article from about 1950 in one of the local papers entitled "Our Prison Time Bomb." And then the governor of the state of Utah, Governor Nate Lee, as I've indicated here, suggested in this comment that the Sugar House prison, this resource, which was really quite architecturally distinguished, was nothing more than a disgrace to the state. In fact, it's worse than a disgrace, and that's all there is to it, according to this quote that was recorded in this period article. And so, not surprisingly, the prison was demolished. When the new prison was built, now the prison we were trying to save, this prison disappeared. As this article states here, it fades away. The ancient prison was leveled. And as a part of this leveling, not only was the building erased, but also the stories that it had to tell. Very compelling stories about the early establishment of the state of Utah, the tragedies of the lives that were spent here, as well as the triumphs. It's a complicated history, but all of that was lost when the building was lost. There's not been a major article or publication that has focused on the history of this site. In fact, the site was, before it was leveled, was burned by the local fire department as practice for fire control, and then it disappeared and became a park. And there's no marker to indicate today where this prison once stood, let alone, of course, any of the rich heritage that existed between the walls that were encoded in these walls. So move up 70 years, this new prison, which replaced that pioneer era structure, is now the old prison, and it's surrounded by development. This is this same building in modern context. All of this development around it has really come to be in the last 10 to 15 years. This was really just an open site up until that point, but now it's in this newly developing tech corridor, and powers that be want it want to bring economic opportunity to this corridor in which this prison sits. And so it is now scheduled to be demolished, or at least it was until Preservation Utah and other groups started to advocate for its preservation. Here's a few more details of the prison. These locking bars are quite unique. The only other place where this locking bar system is replicated is Alcatraz. There are some other great features actually that were taken from the early pioneer era prison and adopted into this prison as a way to save money. So there's this wonderful compilation of old materials and new materials and a lot of history now in these walls. The reason why we want to save this prison is because it tells so much, not about the occupants of the prison, but about all of us, particularly here in the state of Utah. In many ways, this prison is a reflection of the laws that are passed in our state capital, which is a very self-conscious representation of all the people in Utah, from the dome to the fittings of the state capitol building. It's very much about us. And yet those laws that are passed on Capitol Hill here in Salt Lake come down the hill and take form, real form, in the case of the state penitentiary, very potent form. This is a building that represents society and its rules and the way that we have decided to govern ourselves. And so it's a building that implicates all of us, and for that very reason should stay, let alone all the people who have spent a good portion of their lives incarcerated within it. On a more theoretical side, of course, there are all sorts of building histories about prisons. I want to specifically focus on Michel Foucault's masterpiece, Discipline and Punish, which talks about surveillance and how surveillance is used really at the heart of the establishment of the modern nation state in the 15th and 16th centuries up until the present moment, and how surveillance is also an important key to keeping society together, for better, for worse, and how prisons such as our own state penitentiary reflect that. So for these very complicated reasons, I want this building to stand as a way to document all of this history about us, about lives lived in this building on multiple levels. So what can this prison become? There are wonderful examples, for example, in Philadelphia, the Eastern State Penitentiary, one of my favorite buildings in the United States. More locally, the Idaho State Penitentiary in Boise provides a good model of how these buildings can become a museum. And eventually I'd like to have some component of that be a part of this project, referring back to Stephanie's comments in the last presentation, how the site needs to document in a very sensitive way the various histories that it reflects and the various stories that it tells. But it became quite clear to us that arguing that this building should be a museum was a non-starter for the people who ultimately decide the fate of this former prison site. This building has to pay its way. And there are wonderful examples, for example, here in the almost ironically named Liberty Hotel in downtown Boston, which was a former prison. A beautiful adaptive reuse project. Now I think it's run by the Marriott Corporation, but a beautiful hotel, formerly a prison. And also this Lorton prison just outside of Washington, D.C., which was an entire prison yard, prison buildings, prison complex that are being now redeveloped into housing of various sorts. These buildings will likely shortly become supermarkets, art galleries, space for people to live out their lives. And I think this is a wonderful example of how these prisons can be readapted for new lives and new uses. Here locally, we have sort of a burgeoning industry of development of adaptive reuse. A lot of developers are realizing that while adaptive reuse may not always be the easiest route to go, far easier to scrape these buildings and put new buildings on their footprints. If you adaptively reuse some of these historic buildings like Amber talked about, warehouses, you get such a better product and project that is more appealing to more people. So here's an example of a steel mill in downtown Salt Lake that has now been filled with, and there's really no better word to use for these units, but cells, basically small cells that are shared office spaces that have just boomed even during this pandemic, as this article from the local Salt Lake Tribune indicates, that this is a product that people want more of here in Utah and across the nation, and it makes the effort worth it because these projects have such legs once they're finished. economically and otherwise. And nationally, of course, we see this as well. Here's the Twitter billing. My brother-in-law works for Twitter. They have all their meetings in these adaptively reused log cabins from the Sierra Nevadas. We have Twitter in a historic building that's been adaptively reused, and buildings within these buildings. I think a lot of these tech people want to anchor their, at least in terms of the spaces they work in, anchor their lives to something tangible and understandable as they plan out the future. And so that's what we have argued in the redevelopment of this prison site into this brand new city, this new tech-focused city here in Utah. And we are excited that our arguments seem to be taking root. There's now serious talk, whereas before this was seen as a ridiculous proposal, there's now serious talk about reusing all, or at least a good portion of these historic prison buildings. And in the newly developed city that's going around them, these buildings will offer, to borrow that phrase, some there and some context for what came before, and hopefully an opportunity to tell the really compelling stories that I think this building has to tell, and should be known better, especially in terms of what happened to our earlier prison building, a building which was scraped and basically disappeared altogether, along with its stories. So I welcome any feedback that any of you have to offer me, ways that we can advocate for this, insights into how these could be redeveloped in sensitive ways. And again, I just appreciate the opportunity to present this information and look forward to the question and answer session to follow. Thank you.
Great, thank you so much, David. So last but definitely not least is Jane Campbell, and she is a preservation consultant with Roger Lewis in Columbia, South Carolina. She helps clients access historic tax credits by preparing National Register nominations, historic preservation certification applications, and local property tax abatement. She works closely with developers, architects, contractors, and historic preservation staff at the local, state, and federal levels to ensure that all the projects adhere to the Secretary standards. So, Janie, if you'd like to begin.
Thank you, Kathleen. Fun fact, Kathleen and I actually met in undergrad, and Stephanie Gray and I were roommates in graduate school at the University of South Carolina. So this panel feels like home a little bit. As Kathleen gave such a nice introduction, I'm Janie Campbell. I work at Rogers Lewis, Jackson, Mann & Quinn, which is a law firm in Columbia, South Carolina that we do not holistically focus on preservation or on tax credits. There are either 14 or 15 attorneys in our office, 2 of which do historic tax credit work. So this is not, a big operation, although we do represent clients throughout the state, in the upstate, in Columbia, along the coast, anywhere in South Carolina. You can find me almost any day of the week. So being a consultant, as I'm sure many of you have experienced, and I feel like particularly in my position, being in a law firm, so not in a preservation firm or not in a preservation organization, is that kind of tension and push-pull with clients and with developers, trying to retain the kind of spirit of my academic training with the Secretary standards, and doing projects that really reflect the historic character of these buildings that people want to rehabilitate, while also finding a new use and finding ways to fit the developers and the architects' use of the building. So that push and pull can be a fun line to walk, but it usually does end up in the best product. Again, kind of one of the difficulties is that being the sole preservation consultant in our firm and in a lot of these projects is that, unlike with preservation organizations, our success is measured in the dollar signs and then the number of projects. And so again, walking that fine line of preservation ethics and financial monetary gain is it's a difficult one. But in South Carolina, we have the 20% federal credit, as Amber mentioned, but we also have a 25% state credit. And in a lot of instances, most or many historic buildings are often abandoned. And so South Carolina also has a 25% state abandoned building credit. So you can get 70% of your qualified rehabilitation expenses back to you in the form of credit. So it can be a very lucrative endeavor if you do it right. So we'll go ahead and talk about some of these kind of interesting and underpreserved perhaps underrepresented projects that we've worked on. So we were hired by the city of Myrtle Beach, who we had worked with on another project I'll show you in a minute, but to establish a downtown historic district. And I'm sure many of you are probably thinking Myrtle Beach historic. There actually is a kind of small concentrated core downtown that developed in the late 1920s through kind of the 1960s in Myrtle Beach's heyday. So in the upper left-hand corner, you'll see the Chapin Company building that was constructed in many construction episodes, but beginning in 1927 and primarily 1927 through 1936. You'll see on the bottom left-hand corner that is what it looks like today. It has had some 80s stuccoification, which much of Myrtle Beach has suffered, and we're working to pull back that, which you'll see on the big photo on the right. That is Ben's Broadway Theater, and I'm sorry that image in the middle at the bottom did not come out as clearly, but that's a postcard from 1937, I believe, that showed the historic appearance of Ben's Broadway Theater, which is a 1935 movie theater, which, along with the two buildings to the left of it, which you can see one of, will become a theater again, part of Coastal Carolina University and the city of Myrtle Beach are working to have a performing arts center within those three spaces. So that one is still in the beginning stages. I just got the state review sheet for that part one today. So it is really in the beginning stages. If we go to the next slide, you'll see Edwards 5 and Dime. This was built in 1952 in Myrtle Beach. The Edwards store originally began in Charleston. The building is still standing on King Street. It's a beautiful, beautiful building. But it was a Jewish-owned 5 and Dime store that really proliferated from the 1930s through the 1960s. They had outposts in Myrtle Beach, in Savannah, and many inland cities in South Carolina and Georgia. And this was something that in the nomination for listing this entire district, I had hoped to kind of delve into more. But again, when you have a client who's paying you kind of to get things listed and not get into the nitty-gritty details that I personally would really enjoy getting to learn about, you get kind of limited in how far you can go into some of this research. So there were a lot of immigrant Greek, Middle Eastern owned businesses and restaurants in Myrtle Beach that really proliferated in the 1930s and 40s that I really would have enjoyed getting to do more research. So maybe next year for NCPH, I'll get to present a little case study on something like that. But Edwards was a fun one. This is a project that the two attorneys I work with, Robert Lewis and Chris Rogers, hence Rogers Lewis, we represent developers, but they also act as developer in many of these situations. So they purchased this building. It has now become Grand Strand Brewing Company that just recently opened. So if you're in the Myrtle Beach area, I highly suggest you go grab a beer. There are 10 studio apartments upstairs. So if you have a few too many, you can crash there. Those original windows were restored and they overlook the Atlantic Ocean where the pavilion used to be, but was torn down. So that was a fun project that we are very excited to go down and check on soon and celebrate with a beer. Sticking with Myrtle Beach, our next slide talks about the Waikiki Village Motel, which was my master's thesis when I was in graduate school. This is really more of an instance of kind of preservation restoration than rehabilitation. The 1963 mom and pop motel is one of the dwindling resources in Myrtle Beach. When people see postcards of Myrtle Beach, they probably think of these kind of kitschy Populux style motels. More and more of those have fallen to the wayside. We've recently listed the Holiday Shores Motel, which historically was called the Tawana, and reopened that as another kind of branch of the Waikiki Village. It retains its name as Holiday Shores, but same kind of Populux 1960s vibe. But again, these kind of mom and pop owned motels, Robert and Chris purchased this building as well from the original owner's daughter. So since 1963, it has stayed in the family, and this was opened in 2018. So again, if you're in Myrtle Beach, come check it out. The next project is called Colonial Heights or Colite. You are probably familiar with Colite, even if you don't know that you are. Colonial Heights Company started in West Columbia, South Carolina, so just across the river from where I am. And this building, as you can see in the images, is a sprawling kind of campus almost. It started with just kind of that corner building you see in the lower left-hand corner, and when you drive past it, it's kind of in a now scary location. But this sign company started as the melding of two of the Colonial metal letters and Heights Manufacturing Company became Colonial Heights, and they took off from 1951 through 1968, which is the period of significance of this property. They designed the seal the United Nations seal in the UN building in New York. I shouldn't say designed, they manufactured. They manufactured all of the signage at Disney World. They've done signage in the Middle East beginning in the mid to late 60s. So they were an incredibly prolific firm. They are still in operation here in Columbia, just in a different, more modern location and more modern buildings. But I listed this in the National Register in, I believe, 2017. And so this project has been on hold, but has recently been reactivated as, again, kind of one of those holistic kind of campuses of mixed use and many different retail and commercial and restaurant brewery operations coming. Speaking of breweries, we'll head to the next one, which was one of my first projects. The Curtiss Wright hangar is a 1929 airplane hangar that has been sitting pretty much vacant since, I believe, the 80s. It was kind of the elephant in Columbia that nobody knew what to do with. For many, many years, it sat with no one knowing what to do. It was listed by, I believe, a USC Public History Program alum in 1997 to the National Register of Historic Places, thinking that would help get the ball rolling. It did not, and multiple developers have attempted to do something with this. But again, as Amber mentioned back in the panel earlier, it's difficult when you're doing a tax credit project to find a suitable use for these new buildings. So as you can see in the lower photographs, the open space interior of an airplane hangar is kind of the main character defining feature. Those sliding doors across the front also are very iconic. And so finding a suitable use for this space was difficult. Luckily, the first kind of brewer in Columbia from, I believe, the early 90s, he's had a small restaurant and brewery on South Main Street, and he was excited to set up a larger brewing facility. So he opened the Hunter-Gatherer Brewery in the Curtiss Wright hangar. You can now sit on the observation deck and watch the planes from the nearby Jim Owens, Hamilton Field, Owens Field airplanes, kind of private planes fly in and out just adjacent to this building. So you still very much get that aviation history feel, but you can enjoy a beer while you do it. Our next slide shows, again, kind of, this one is just off the ground. It's the Saluda Apartments, built from 1947 to 1949 by Thomas Harmon. Harmon, interestingly enough, again, I just was researching and digging into this. Harmon was a Hartsville native, Hartsville, South Carolina native, joined the Navy, and right before, oh gosh, I should know this. He basically he was an associate architect at the Pentagon. So finding information like that, along with this being post-war housing for returning white veterans, is helping tell the story of public housing in Columbia and how that shift has changed from what it maybe was initially used for to what it's become, and then what it's going to be used for. Again, this will be more of a preservation restoration project. It's apartments, it will remain apartments. It's just getting kind of a freshening up and a bit of a structural update. And then the final project I'll touch on is the Crest Building in Orangeburg, South Carolina. When our client came to us looking to do this as a tax credit project, it was located within the Orangeburg Downtown Historic District, but was not a contributing building because it post-dated the period of significance. So given the chance to update the nomination, we included, of course, African-American history or ethnic heritage Black, as it is listed, because this was the site of a major sit-in for the civil rights movement. It is also proximally located to the site of the Orangeburg massacre. So we were able to tell more than just the kind of commercial story of downtown Orangeburg. We also re-examined many of the buildings in downtown Orangeburg had a high Jewish population and had a thriving Jewish business district. And so we were able to include that as well. So hopefully one of those buildings will be available for a rehabilitation as well. But that is all that I have. And I'd like to open it up, I guess, or hand it back to Kathleen to open it up to everybody.
Yeah, so thanks everyone so much for your presentations. It's always great to see how wide and varied historic tax credits can be, but more importantly, how much adaptive reuse can help preserve stories throughout the US. So I'll open it up now for questions from the audience. So just feel free to unmute and introduce yourself and we can carry on the conversation.
I don't have a question, but I have an observation.
Yeah, go ahead.
I'm Michael Binder. I work for the Department of the Air Force. We deal with technological facilities, which take some explicit explanation for people to understand. And my comment is, in watching all of these examples, I come away with the impression that you believe that by preserving the building, you've told the story. But if somebody didn't attend this session, they wouldn't know the stories, it seems. So I'm wondering, how do you tell the stories beyond just preserving the building?
I'll jump in. I like to think that usually with historic tax credit projects, people, maybe everyday laymen who do not understand preservation or tax credits, find something in a building and say, well, that's weird. Why did they do it this way? And they might ask their server or ask the hotel manager or whoever is owning or occupying the building, why did y'all make that choice? Or this is kind of a weird way of doing this. And that for me has often sparked the conversation of, oh, well, we weren't allowed to do this, or we had to preserve this because this building historically was used as, and you get to go from there. But right, on the outset, there's not an immediate, this was originally this, and these are the stories that we get to tell. So it kind of comes in fits and starts, I guess.
Yeah. Ruth, did you have?
Yeah, I can jump in. I don't see where I could raise my hand, so I'm just going to jump in. In California, we're highly regulated, and historic buildings are part of the environment. And so there are environmental laws that protect and encourage the preservation of historic buildings. That doesn't always happen. And typically when there are impacts because of adaptive reuse or additions or even demolition, sometimes the building's stories aren't quite as obvious when the rehabilitation occurs. And so there's very often, an interpretive planning program that is required that can reinforce the stories of the buildings or the sites or the landscapes, especially as they get impacted by change over time. So that's been very helpful for us in terms of being able to tell more robust stories than sometimes the architecture can provide.
Just to jump in here myself, first of all, I think this is a great question. And I think there are a variety of interpretive models that people can adapt to their building to tell the story. But I would argue as well that just the presence of the building adds a certain texture, a certain transfer of knowledge that, of course, if it wasn't preserved, would not occur. I really even think that just the presence of a building or a group of buildings in a city does add a tangible benefit, also an intangible benefit to the passerby, whether he or she be an expert in what that building represents or just a casual observer.
Well, a lot of it is up to the client. So private owners are under no obligation to tell stories or provide interpretation unless local laws do that. But what I've found with a lot of the projects that I've worked on is that they get really excited about it and they do it of their own volition. And so whether it's having stories that are in the menu or having plaques or having audio tours, like there's lots of really creative ways to do that. And because there's such a financial incentive with the tax credits and also the environmental impact of how much reusing historic buildings is better for the environment, I'm noticing a lot more that then they're also wanting to preserve the stories once they learn about them themselves.
Do you have time for another question?
Yeah, we do. I think we have, we have 9 more minutes. So.
Awesome. I'm Sarah Patton-Zarelli, and I'm a museum consultant in the Boston area. And I was really interested to hear both in the example of the state hospital and also thinking about the Liberty Hotel in Boston as well as the prison site in Utah, these more challenging stories. And the Liberty Hotel, which I'm more familiar with, has done some interesting branding in terms of like escaping, quote unquote, from daily life, kind of making light of the prison experience and what incarceration means. And likewise, in this case of the state hospital, is the bone-in barbecue really the best name for that? I wondered if the panelists could speak a little bit about how difficult history can be brought up in these places in a way that is not necessarily gloom and doom, but also not in a way that we laugh it off or ignore the real costs and impacts of how we institutionalize individuals on a daily basis.
Stephanie, do you want to go first?
Sure. Yeah. Thank you, Sarah. That's a great question. And you highlighted, I think, the inherent conflict in some of these fantastic historic spaces that are important because of their association with marginalized communities, and they tell difficult stories. And sometimes when you move toward rehabilitation or adaptive use, you don't want to elevate those because it might alienate an audience or a public you're trying to attract, especially in terms of a prison history or history of a lunatic asylum. It's kind of a marketing game in a sense. Nonetheless, as a public historian, of course, I'm an advocate of saying it's so critical to the city's fabric, the state's fabric, nation's fabric, to make sure those stories don't get lost in the mix, right? They're not just covered over by a really cool, brewery or whatever. And I think that there are ways to both, rehabilitate a space that makes it comfortable for a modern audience, whether that be new residents of an apartment complex or hotel visitors, but also doesn't ignore the past people who lived, worked, struggled in those sites. And I think one way is through some kind of interpretive planning, or I know not every developer is going to want to put up wayside stands or plaques on a building, but that's a way that folks can choose to engage or disengage with history. There can also be an incorporation of social programming that gives a nod to what historic communities have been throughout the site, that it can both be relevant to communities and folks engaging with those historic spaces, but aren't required, again, not pushing uncomfortable histories in the face of contemporary audiences. But it's a little nudge, a reminder, like, hey, we recognize this site, we recognize past lives that have lived here and worked here, and kind of incorporate those narratives into functioning, appropriate spaces. So I'm not sure if I fully addressed your question, but I'm interested to hear what David has to say about
well, thank you, Stephanie. And I'll echo what Stephanie said. That's a great question. It's actually a question that has kept me up many a nights since we started on advocating for the retention of the prison. To be quite frank, the problem I face with saving the prison is that a lot of, especially here in Utah, which is a conservative state, a lot of the politicians are terrified of saving the prison and turning it into some sort of memorial for, as they put it, dangerous criminals. And so we fight that battle. And then we also fight, the battle of, what Stephanie highlighted, the sort of trivialization of really important stories. And I think in moving forward, threading this needle, my strategy is to consult, and I really do hope that Preservation Utah is a part of this process as the prison saved and then interpreted. I really do hope that I'm able to consult with people like those on the call, Sarah and Stephanie, and get ideas about how to do this and ways to recommend interpretation of the site as it's redeveloped for new uses. One idea and one possibility that the prison itself presents is the prison chapel. This is a chapel that the prisoners actually started a riot inside the prison to have built back in the mid-50s. And I thought, what a wonderful place to reserve for sort of a memory space of some sort, to be interpreted as such, while a lot of the other prison buildings are given over to businesses or other uses to maintain this one space as a center of memory and make that center of memory flexible. People can bring to it what they already have, and then perhaps through the interpretation of that space, bring something out of it as well. So I really look forward to seeing how this all develops at the Utah site, and I'm anxious to consult with as many of you on the calls as I possibly can to help us figure this out and do it well and do it right.
And with a comment on this one as well.
I'm sorry, was that me?
I'd said Ruth, but I didn't. We can go Ruth and then Charlotte if that's.
I was on mute. I didn't know if somebody else said that they had something to say, and I know we're about out of time, but I have actually two sort of case studies that help to answer the question that was asked. We've been working for at least a dozen years on a series of developmental centers that have been surplused by the state to developers or other jurisdictions who've taken over those properties over time. And one that we're working with, which is the Agnews Developmental Center, is a campus that was a very large campus. It's right in the middle of Silicon Valley, in the middle of development pressures. And so that complex all of the institutional buildings there ended up being demolished. They were purchased by a school system, and they're having an entire K through 12 school, 3 different schools constructed on that site. And there's a tremendous amount of interpretive planning that is going into those schools that are going to be completed within the next, I think, 4 to 6 months. So each school has, is being told, in each school is going to be told various portions of the story of that site. Which had a long history, an agricultural history before it had a mental health systems history, and we did a lot of oral histories where we interviewed the people that had worked in the developmental center over time. The oral histories are going to be part of a lobby display in the most public high school building in a performing arts center lobby. But then in the grammar school and the middle school, we've developed a series of interpretive plans and stories that are geared toward the age level of the people that are going to be in that building. So that's a very robust way of telling the stories of a place that doesn't exist anymore. And then the counterpoint to that is we're currently working at another developmental center in Sonoma County that was actually the one place in the United States that best tells the story of the eugenics movement. And that is not a story that people want to know about or talk about, but that developmental center has a tremendous emotional connection to the community because it was the primary employment center for the residents. And what I find interesting there, and we're doing adaptive reuse studies, what I find interesting is that the community doesn't care as much about the physical fabric as they do some of the intangible memories and the cemetery that's there. So they're not as concerned about preserving the buildings as they are about preserving the attachment that the community has to the place.
Well, and that echoes a lot with what Charlotte was saying in their presentation about involving the actual local community in that and working with community groups. And I think that's something that's sometimes challenging when you're working with a developer to tell them, hey, these people that you've never heard of that are in this space actually have a voice and they want to be a part of this. And Charlotte, I think you had something that you were gonna say as well.
That pretty much sums it up. And I know it can be difficult to get, you know, a developer with private funds to engage the community, but sometimes it is possible. And having those voices to help say whether something really would be insensitive or is a story that needs to be told in a certain way. You know, you never know when it's actually going to make your project a lot better and more appealing to a wider range of the public, which I think anybody who's trying to engage in something that's income generating is interested in, even if they just want to look at it from a pure dollars and cents side and not from an interpretive side. But just knowing that there are probably people who were impacted as part of that marginalized community or their descendants who would really welcome the chance to at least make comment and to make their feelings known, even if in some cases they may not be directly involved if it's a private venture. But certainly if we're talking about a public venture in any way, this should be, you know, no question that this should be in the hands as much as possible of people who were impacted and let them have that voice.
Yeah, and I think Kim, was your hand up? The Zoom thing has flashed.
It was, but I know we're after 3, so I can keep my mouth shut if we need to end.
I think my understanding is it can go slightly longer because like there's no one coming in this room.
Okay.
Next, so I don't want to like make it too long, but I think there's a gap. So we want to go like 5 more minutes if people still want to. But if you need to leave, feel free to pop off.
Yeah, I was just going to ask briefly. So, you know, obviously, all of you have referenced that I should say, I'm Kim Campbell. I'm the Director of Interpretation and Preservation at the Coastal Georgia Historical Society and a former tax credit consultant here in Georgia. And so I'm well aware of how attached we are to private developers having to fund these projects and how if they are not interested in interpreting the history that you're beholden to them. There's not a lot that you can do. So I'm just curious, especially with the example at Bull Street, you know, where do you feel the line is between there's a chance to interpret the history there, right? Is it in good taste? No. But is it better than leaving the history off entirely? Is it a chance? Do you feel it's a chance to engage people? It does sort of point towards this was the history of the morgue. Why does this place even need a morgue? Or is it too, you know, is it flippant and you think it's just not worth it? That not just the insulting people, but that it's going to get no benefit to it.
Yeah, hi Kim, thanks for the question. I think the morgue is a particularly difficult building to work with. And that's probably why I highlighted it in the presentation. I think an example I'll introduce here is one of the sites on the campus that you'll be familiar with because of your research done on the site is the Parker Annex. So for folks, it was this was a segregated state hospital, and this is where African-American patients were housed. So it was a less fancy building. It was off in a corner. You know, it's relegated as a secondary structure. But that has been protected and it has been rehabilitated to be used as an archaeological center. It was also the site, Kim, and you can chime in here if I'm wrong, of a Civil War camp. I think so, right? So there has already been a lot of archaeological evidence found. And it's taking a building with a very particular interest or intersection of history with mental health patients and segregated African-American male patients, and now making it an education center as part of the University of South Carolina. The morgue, I don't know if it's more difficult to give it a contemporary use that doesn't push forward the morgue story and make folks uncomfortable. I don't know, maybe that's what we'll put our efforts in interpretation and education on different buildings on the site's campus. But I think the Parker Annex is a great case of working with neighboring institutions like USC right down the road to tell the history, continue educational purposes, but then also leave space for residential growth, commercial growth on that, almost 200-acre campus.
Well, and I think some of what I've heard and sort of like more theoretical pushings and what an ideal world is that some communities, when you're having developers get tax credits or getting to build in certain spaces, they have to like give back X percentage to the community, whether it's in affordable housing or whether it's paying for upgraded infrastructure. And I think that's something that we should try to push within our communities, is that like, okay, if you're getting these tax credits, right, like what are you also doing to preserve some of the other aspects of it, right? So are you working with the local communities? Are you doing interpretive signing? Are you making sure that the material that you're not reusing doesn't go in a landfill in some way, right? So there's some part of it that they can't use in that design project. Can it get saved another way? And those are like big questions to try to put on, but I think that's something that if we can start pushing for. David? Yeah,
push CBAs, community benefit agreements with developers to try to capture exactly what you said, Kathleen. Sorry, David, chimed in there.
No, just to make a quick point that has really already been made, but I just want to bring it to the fore. Developers are not the only ones with exclusive rights to an important story. Statewide can tell stories, local communities, local historic commissions. If you don't like the way a developer, for example, is telling a story, then feel free to engage with the community, tell it yourself, or find another organization who has a platform that you can utilize to get out the message that you like. We here at Preservation Utah are always telling stories about buildings that we think are misinterpreted, and to great success, the community receives those stories with open arms.
There's a lot going on with virtual reality. So there is a place in Chile where essentially Nazis fled Nazi Germany and moved to Chile and started this community that was really problematic and obviously had pedophilia, and that's where the Chilean government was sending political activists to make them disappear. And the center now is like a Bavarian themed summer camp where like people go on honeymoons. And so the activists that are pushing for this real history to be told like are prohibited from going to the building. So they set it up as a complete virtual reality to say that we don't have these buildings, but like our families were raped here, tortured here, killed here, and you don't get to own the stories even though you own the stones. So. Well, I think we're probably over enough that we should say goodbye, but it was great talking with everyone, and I hope we can continue these conversations. So take care, everyone.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, folks.
Thank you.